The way asking for wildfire prevention basically goes a little something like this. A risk management expert, a disaster person, someone who works in natural resources, forestry that knows this pretty well, either and or, will say, hey, we should invest more in wildfire prevention. This money goes a long way. It's a no-brainer. They make some sort of plea to priorities or policy change or whatever. Then the issue is not taken seriously. So 1, we try it. 2, the issue is not taken seriously. 3, there is then a follow-up significant firestorm and a bunch of people die and a bunch of communities burn and we have to spend a significant amount of money on healthcare costs and rebuilding and relocation and emergency assistance and a whole bunch of stuff. The cost of that ends up being more than if we just spent money on the prevention in the first place. The risk expert then basically says some version of I told you so, and then asks for the government or whoever to now fund the issue. So that's what happens, and then it's ignored again. And then the cycle continues. That's essentially what happens, and that's not exclusive to fires. That's risk management in general. That happens all the time. There are so many risks in the world. There are so many priorities. People choose their priorities, and if you're an expert in a particular area with a particular risk, you think that your thing is the most important thing very often, and when people say no, you go, what are you, idiots? And then you think yes, they think whatever they think, and life moves on. So wildfires are burning nearby again because it is wildfire season. And I thought it would be a good idea to take the opportunity to talk about wildfires and learn about those. There's this phenomenon in disaster risk reduction where if you don't address the issue, the underlying hazard that relates to the disaster while it's ongoing, the likelihood that it will be taken seriously or that changes will be put in place to lessen the risk in the long term gets closer and closer to zero. If you have a wildfire that's going on right now, you have at most a month, usually probably a few weeks, from the onset of it or while it's in the news cycle to get the government or private industry or whoever to invest money into fixing wildfires. Once that timeline is gone, basically the world moves on, people don't care, and you're not getting the funding. So it's very important within this field, when you're looking at different hazards and different sorts of disasters, to focus on, okay, what do we do next? Actually, while the response is actively ongoing, because people move on very, very quickly. It can seem kind of distasteful to a lot of people to do that, but it's just one of those sort of realities of the situation. The time you go around putting your hand out and asking for money and saying, hey, we need to fix this problem now, is immediately people move on. So anyways, great opportunity to talk about wildfires as well. There's an active wildfire going on. When you're dealing with wildfires, the hazard is pretty straightforward for a lot of people. Basically, you have a big fire burning in a forest, and whatever it burns gets put up in the plume of smoke and particulate matter. Your threat to life is fire. The stuff the fire knocks over, like trees and roads falling on people, trapping them, and then the smoke itself being a health hazard. Depending on how close you are to it, the health hazard can be acute or chronic, acute being sort of an immediate threat, chronic being like a long-term condition. The air quality index in my area, from a 1 to 10 scale, the public health department uses a 1 to 10 plus scale, has been 10 plus several times over the last couple of days. Right now, while I'm recording, is actually the only sort of break I've had during daylight for about an hour or two, where the air quality risk index has been at minimal or basically nothing. We've kind of lucked out with where the smoke is coming and everything to have enough opportunity for me to enjoy the outside. So you're concerned about fire, the stuff the fire knocks over and gets in your way, traps you otherwise, if you're very close to it. And then really air quality is the threat that you're thinking about when it comes to wildfires. Because this is actively ongoing and the question around being productive with wildfires is a lot about where should we be spending our money and how is this thing being handled, etc. I'm going to talk a bit about what's happening now in Ontario with the Ontario wildfires, because that's sort of the event that kind of spawned this video. And then I'm going to break down what we do for that and some of the background in it with response and with prevention specifically, and then give some sort of recommendations and some pie in the sky ideas to help fix things. So every year in Ontario, there are wildfires. This is a seasonal event. When temperature heats up, areas get dry, and certain parts of forest basically hit their part of their life cycle, they will catch fire. Now, there's many different reasons why forests catch fire. It's actually part of their normal life cycle. In order for new plants to grow, the old plants that are hogging too much water and that are old, are inefficient, and are drying out, need to basically die and be reconverted into essentially natural fertilizer. And the sort sort of ecosystem needs to recover from the tree getting too old. Because nature doesn't just chop down a tree, the way this happens is through fire, healing the forest effectively. This is something that is very important to boreal tundra, boreal forests. Boreal forests are Canadian forests. Canada has more boreal forests per capita, so per person, than anywhere else in the world. And it has the second most forests after Russia, just in total. So like we have a lot, and they all kind of follow this kind of requiring fire to maintain themselves ecosystem issue. The way these fires are caused is either generally through human activity or through lightning strikes. Now, in other parts of the world, it tends to mostly be human activity that causes them. In Canada, lightning strikes make up 40 to 45%-ish of all forest fires. And that's just the percentage of things that cause, but every fire is unique. So just because a fire is caused doesn't mean it becomes a huge one. When you look at the really, really big fires, the way that's measured is through percentage of area burned. And when you look at percentage of area burned, and this is pretty standard across the world, in a lot of countries that have lightning-caused wildfires, the lightning strikes actually amount for more than 50% of all the area burned, even though it's so few, relatively speaking, of the events compared to human caused. And in Canada, it's over 80%. Over 80% of our forests burn because a lightning strike hits a tree way out in, uninhabited land with a whole bunch of dead forests that we just haven't found yet, or that we didn't get to address. So just keep in mind that this lightning strike wildfire thing is part of a natural forest ecosystem. This is something that we expect to basically live with because we live here. This isn't necessarily a standard human-caused phenomenon. On the global warming piece, because this will be brought up because people will know about this, yes, when you have climate change, global warming, where temperature increases, it does increase the rate at which some forests dry out, and it does change wildfire risk to some degree. But in Canada, because the further north you go, the colder it gets. When you have mild amounts of global warming or climate change in Canada, more trees end up growing in the long term. Canada's forest systems actually benefit initially from global warming / climate change. And then later on, like, everything dies, but when it gets way too hot. But initially, we actually gain more forest land when that occurs. So it's the global warming climate change piece of this is complicated. And when you look at the effect on that sort of more macro scale, the question is how many trees grow back? Because when you net gain trees from them catching on fire, in general, then you've actually had a positive influence effectively on the climate change piece. I'm not going to go into climate change much more other than that, but just the questions would come up, and they do come up, so I thought I'd just address that. The thing that people will mention is desertification. Canada doesn't experience desertification, the destruction of forests in their entirety from forest fires, the same way that other places in the world tend to. It's just not the same sort of phenomenon. We have a lot of trees here. Okay. This is natural. We have to deal with it. In Ontario, this happens every year. Very, very frequently, we will have to go into Northern Ontario, especially near the First Nations communities, the reserves and other communities with a lot of First Nations people there because they happen to live nearby a lot of these forests. There's a whole history on that, but just for people who don't know, we have that here, and that is the communities generally that are most directly impacted by these. John, I think I sent an article of a First Nation in Northern Ontario for this wildfire that actually got completely wiped out. Not the people, but the infrastructure, and they basically have nothing to go back to. Every year when this sort of thing happens, we'll have to do evacuations. While the evacuation won't necessarily be the same community every year, and some years are very, very mild and we kind of get away with it, on any given year, we will expect in Ontario that we will have to do evacuations. This is a standard thing. Emergency Management Ontario, or OFMEM, or whatever it is called, depending on the area you're in, has this as an expected sort of routine thing that it's going to be doing. You expect that you're going to have to move people from northern areas in Ontario to other areas because their communities are going to be at wildfire risk. This is a regular thing. It was a few cases a few years back. I have to find the exact case again, but there was one event where certain communities had a situation where the tops of the trees were burning specifically, and at the same time, there was a flood. So they had situations where their roofs were on fire while their basement was flooded at the same time. Really, really weird phenomenons. Some really interesting things from, an academic standpoint can happen here. So this is a regular thing. You have to get the people who are nearby the fire and move them, because you can't keep somebody in the middle of a fire. When you do that, and this is going to be, the response piece. So talking about how you're responding to a wildfire, you got to evacuate. You've got to put people somewhere once you've evacuated them, so they have to live somewhere. You can't just, move somebody on a bus and say, here you go, and drop them off. Well, I mean, you could, but we don't, because it's not practical. People have necessities to live. And the Canadian climate without modern amenities can be pretty hostile. So you want to give people a, reasonable place to live here. You have to figure that whole piece out, and which is going to have emergency shelters, local members of the community they're going to, bringing them into their own homes and helping them. If you want a relatively famous example of this, there was a Canadian play and musical, I believe, called Come From Away, which was about people after 9/11 who had their planes turned around, landed in Newfoundland, I believe. They landed in the Maritimes, and because of that event, the local people brought them into their homes and helped them as emergency housing effectively. But that's irrespective of hazard. You could do that for any sort of evacuation, or, hey, there's a bunch of people here now. So you have to figure out emergency shelters. You need to figure out how they're going to eat. You've got to figure out these logistics, and eventually you've got to figure out how to get them back. But in the initial response, so the first few weeks type of deal, it's get them out and then get them a place to live in the short term. Now, when you're doing evacuations, this is a factor of how many people you have and how many sort of pathways you have to get them out. This is a logistics issue effectively. When dealing with this, sometimes with wildfires, if you're evacuating people through roads, the trees will fall and be burning or whatever and block roads, and then your roads become non-existent. If you have two highways and then one is blocked by a tree, this means you now have one highway. So your congestion on said highway is now increased by 100%. It has doubled. This is a problem. This is always a logistics issue. How many people? How far are you getting them? What's the method of transportation? Airlifting people is great. It's easier to fit more people in a bus than it is into a small helicopter. So this is a question. Now, during this event, this one in Ontario, there have been news articles, and there's been some reporting on people from these communities saying, look, we don't know what's happening with the buses. This is a question mark, and we don't have a lot of time to ask, hey, is something coming? We need to know if something's coming. And this evacuation issue isn't unique to the wildfires in Ontario now. This has been a standard sort of challenge that people deal with in evacuations for any number of things, for hurricanes, flooding that is going to occur, what have you. Anytime you have some lead time or warning before the disaster hits and you can do these sorts of evacuations, what's happening with the buses ends up becoming a question pretty often. So in the interest of the evacuation, look, you get them out. Hopefully you have enough time where they can escape. They get to the city. Because in Ontario this happens so regularly, some cities actually experience the intake of these evacuees very, very frequently. And it's basically on a seasonal cycle. I know people may or may not like the way I'm describing this. In a lot of ways, it's effectively seasonal wildfire forced tourism. So they don't want to be tourists, but effectively you're forced to be because of the wildfire. But from a city management or city planning perspective, it's very similar to when a regular festival or rock concert or something that once every 2 years or something would happen in the town. You're expecting an influx of a certain number of people, a certain amount of extra water needs to be used, a certain amount of extra food needs to be distributed, people need to be housed, etc. You're intaking people. Doesn't matter why you're intaking people. But from a planning perspective, you could think of it similar to a tourism event, except with this one, they don't have necessarily the same amount of financial freedom that a tourist would. The expensing is a bit different. But in this case, instead of a private sector tourist bringing in money for a rock concert, what will sometimes happen is a different government, provincial government, federal government, will compensate the municipality for helping these people. So it's still effectively a revenue stream, but the government's paying you, not the private citizen for the rock concert. And there is that angle, which I thought you guys might want to know or think about. So we've talked about the evacuation piece, and I want to talk about fighting the fire. So when you're doing response, you basically have protect people, fight fire. This is the fight fire piece. When you're fighting the fire, when you're fighting any fire really, there's something called the fire triangle or the fire tetrahedron. The fire triangle, we'll focus on that one because the tetrahedron adds in the continuous chemical reaction, and the main three that doesn't include that will serve our purposes for now. You need oxygen, you need heat, and you need fuel. If you get rid of one of them, the fire doesn't start. You need all three. When you're attacking a fire or when you're trying to reduce the risk of it, be it through prevention, response, whatever you're doing, you're going to be looking at getting rid of one or more of these things. And usually the thing that you're doing is going to target or focus that. With that in mind, most response to fire is going to basically fall into a few different categories. Roughly speaking, the categories of dealing with fire is going to be throw water or other chemical on it in some form, get rid of fuel source before the fire gets there. This is known as a fire break, or incident management. Now, incident management, I'm going to explain a bit later, but I'll just go through all three. It's just easier. It's easier that way. Now, look, when you're throwing water onto stuff, the idea here is that you're getting rid of the heat and you're getting rid of the oxygen. The fuel's still there. It's wet now. But by introducing water to the system, you have cooled the system down, so you've reduced the heat, which might not be enough to put the fire out completely, because you might have a little water and a lot of fire, but it's going to still start basically poking it in the direction of making it harder to sustain this reaction. The other thing that you do with water is you start smothering the fire. I don't really want to get into the complex explanation for how it does this, because that can be quite lengthy. But the oxygen in water, it can't fuel fire because you can't really break the bond with the way fire works with it. And the interaction of water being introduced to combustion in this way is such that it makes it harder for it to continue. So you're attacking the triangle from two different angles. You're not attacking fuel. You just need to stop one and then the fire goes out. So that's the idea with water being applied. When water is applied in a forest fire context, they use large trucks, they use water bombers, they hope for rain because rain helps a lot. They'll have pieces of technology that spray different chemicals that do other things than water, but the effect is still basically to get rid of heat or get rid of the oxygen in the environment to smother the fire. That's all you're really doing. I want to talk about water bombers a bit because specific to this fire, there has been the now request for, or believe purchase of water bombers by Ontario to address the response capability for fires. Ontario's strategy for fighting wildfires is very, very response-based. It's not very prevention-based. This has been fairly controversial, and I'll get into the specifics of this later. But on the response angle, we've purchased quite a few water bombers. A water bomber is basically a bomber plane that's payload is a bunch of water. The idea is that when it's not raining, you want to just kind of douse the fire with as much you creating the rain as possible to smother it. Water bombers are the solution that is being focused on, or the risk control that's being focused on predominantly right now when you're dealing with wildfires. Are there better ones or worse ones? Depends. It's a big risk debate. But right now, that's what's being done, and we're spending quite a bit of money on that. I'll talk about the money part with this later. Okay, after the fire has moved, this is still part of a water category, there's something called mop up and patrol. You end up patrolling the area once the fire has sort of moved on, and then you'll find these little spot fires that are still burning that could reignite and create secondary wildfires or secondary hazards. So after the fire's moved on, it isn't necessarily done. It might still actually be burning. It might actually be burning underground or in underbrush. So there's work where firefighters and people in risk management, so firefighter adjacent, will go into the wilderness and they will try to find these fires where the burning was done and put those out directly. This is still water being applied because the fuel's still there. But that does happen too. So just keep in mind, even though the fire's out, it's not necessarily out. You have to wait until you know it's out, right? Let's talk about fire breaks. Okay, so the way a fire break works. Let's say that you have a giant wildfire here. It has to burn stuff. It needs fuel. And as long as there's fuel, it's going to keep burning. If this right here is a coastline and the fire gets to the coastline, now it has no fuel. It has hit a coastline. And either A, it has to be able to carry embers and things that can ignite across the air and actually get past that coastline, or it has been broken, hence fire break. So there's no additional fuel. Now, a fire break doesn't have to be a coastline. It's just a coastline tends to be sort of an extreme fire break and is sort of a good visual example. Anytime you have an area that is in the direction the fire is going that doesn't have fuel, you have a fire break. These can be naturally made, they can be artificially made, and from a firefighting strategy point of view, when you artificially make them, there's a bunch of different ways. Now, Keep in mind I said the direction the fire is going. Fires go in the direction with the wind. The wind basically blows the fire and directs the embers to go towards a certain direction, and that's where the fire kind of populates to. Fire, generally speaking, is not going to be traveling upwind. It doesn't want to. It wants to go where the wind is blowing. And the stronger winds are, usually the farther fire will end up spreading. This, of course, is until you hit an extreme case, because, I mean, if you had, tornado level winds, the fire might not be able to sustain itself. But generally with wildfires, you don't have that. So stronger wind, faster fire is going. So you want to make a fire break. If you want to make a fire break, what you can do is actually light the forest on fire. Now, let's explain this. Let's say that you have this area, right? You have this big area with fire here, and that you have this, and this is all forest, and you know this is all forest, and it's going to be going into more and more dry underbrush, and you're worried about this fire going here. If you can estimate basically that this fire is going to reach here in about a day or an hour or whatever, how much time you have, what you can do is you can actually very quickly go into this area and burn away all of the underbrush and all of the extra material before this fire gets there. By doing that, then by the time this fire gets there, there's already been a fire here, it's already burnt away all the fuel, and now this has no fuel to burn. It actually stops this. This is actually one of the ways in which wildfire management will literally fight fire with fire. You're removing the fuel from that fire triangle. Sometimes if fire isn't an option or the best tool to be used here, they will actually just clear away with essentially forestry, construction style equipment, all the area. There's any number of ways to make fire breaks, but once again, the idea is you're removing the fuel directly so that the fire has nothing to burn once it arrives somewhere downwind. If the wind shifts, you did a bunch of work and then the fire's messing with you. This happens very frequently. Yeah, fire breaks are a tough job. Fighting fires in general is actually fairly sophisticated. You need a lot of detection equipment. You need to know about the information that's going on across a very large area. So this can be tricky. It's not just, point water at the thing. We have this huge area. Where even is the fire specifically? Yes, there's a lot that goes into this. Satellites have helped. Satellites have helped a lot. Okay, incident management. Incident management was invented in the 1970s to help fight wildfires in California. Incident management is now used as a system for virtually all types of emergencies. It's really good at basically managing how to deal with the bad thing that's going on. We teach it in disaster management. We teach it in emergency management. There's a portion of incident management in the Continuity 101 playlist that we have on this channel. Incident management is integral. It was invented for wildfire fighting once again. Wildfire fighting is complicated. You have a very large area. There's a lot of logistics. The particulate matter that is caught up in the fire can interfere with communications technology sometimes. You're fighting an information battle while you're fighting all this other stuff. You don't have enough people that can coat an entire wildfire. It's just going to be bigger than you are. So you have to do precision targeting. This is an information battle. I'm not going to go into the specifics on incident management because we have other videos for that, but just keep in mind that this is a major part of the way modern wildfires are fought and the way this stuff is handled. It's a major component of the response element of this. Let's talk about prevention mitigation. So this is the other piece. So this is, I don't want the fire to happen in the first place. With wildfires, similar to floods and a few other hazards, you tend to save $10 for every dollar you spend on mitigation, generally speaking, or better. So the return on investment from preventing damage is very, very good with wildfires. For that reason, critics of various governments' policies on how they handle wildfires will often say, why don't we just do more prevention? And I would say in general, they're right. Now, I'm not going to come down on one particular government this way. I know that right now in Ontario, we have the Conservative Ford government. However, the reality is that not really respecting the hazard that is wildfires to the degree that experts would like people to, or even really close to that degree, is something that has happened at all levels of government for decades and decades. This isn't one particular government in one particular region's challenge. This has sort of just been a pervasive issue across the board where there's a disconnect between subject matter experts and policymakers where just that hasn't been sort of fixed yet. I'm going to say some things that are pretty critical of the current government's priorities, but that's not indicative of this government. That's something that's been indicative, in my estimation, of most governments. Just keep that in mind. And I'm saying most because I'm hedging that it's not all, but it might be all. But it's most for sure. Okay, the way asking for wildfire prevention basically goes a little something like this. A risk management expert, a disaster person, someone who works in natural resources, forestry that knows this pretty well, either and or, will say, hey, we should invest more in wildfire prevention. This money goes a long way. It's a no-brainer. They make some sort of plea to priorities or policy change or whatever. Then the issue is not taken seriously. So 1, we try it. 2, the issue is not taken seriously. 3, there is then a follow-up significant firestorm and a bunch of people die and a bunch of communities burn and we have to spend a significant amount of money on healthcare costs and rebuilding and relocation and emergency assistance and a whole bunch of stuff. The cost of that ends up being more than if we just spent money on the prevention in the first place. The risk expert then basically says some version of I told you so, and then asks for the government or whoever to now fund the issue. So that's what happens, and then it's ignored again. And then the cycle continues. That's essentially what happens, and that's not exclusive to fires. That's risk management in general. That happens all the time. There are so many risks in the world. There are so many priorities. People choose their priorities, and if you're an expert in a particular area with a particular risk, you think that your thing is the most important thing very often. And when people say no, you go, what are you, idiots? And then you think yes, they think whatever they think, and life moves on. That phenomenon occurs. So if you're somebody who works with wildfires, who works in this area, who knows this, you're probably similar to those experts that is incredibly frustrated with the lack of focus on prevention and mitigation. Ontario specifically, as I said before, is very response focused. We do not put much focus into mitigation or prevention the same way. For example, the emergency forest firefighting budget was approximately $177 million in 2024 to 2025. In the 2025 to 2026 budget, so the next year's budget, it went down to $135 million, which was a reduction about 24%. The first budget I'm talking about here is the change in actually response. So they lowered the amount of money dedicated towards response, and within that, they actually ended up spending $271 million on an emergency basis because the fires got bad. So even though they spent this amount on their budget, they ended up having to basically, well, no, not basically, more than double their expenditure because fires happened, which they always do. That's response. When you look at the prevention budget, it's part of a different ministry. It's part of Ministry of Natural Resources, and it's actually a subline item that's within public protection. And we don't know how much is actually spent within that, because that subline item for natural resources is public protection for everything, for floods, for fires, for everything. And we don't know how much is actually dedicated towards fires. And we'll put the chart up of that now. You'll notice that the number is actually increasing there, which is good, but we don't know what it's being spent on. And within that budget as well, there's actually an allotment that's placed for response. So this is what appears to be a prevention budget that has response in it. So for all we know, we could just not be doing really prevention anywhere close, and this could just be more response money. You know, there's a lot of money for the putting water on the fire firefighting, but there isn't a lot of money for making so the fires don't start in the first place. This is going to come up again and again and again and again when you look more deeply into this. Frustrations around why don't we just stop the fires in the first place? Okay, how do you stop a fire in the first place? How do you stop a wildfire from happening? Controlled burns. So a controlled burn or a prescribed burn, depending on which word you want to use. I say controlled, but some people prefer prescribed, up to you, your choice. A controlled burn is when you find a part of forest and you carefully, this is not easy work to do, this is sophisticated work, you need professionals that know how to handle this, you light it on fire and then you put it out. And similar to the fire break, what you're doing is you're removing the fuel source. Young trees and very moist vegetation that's full of water doesn't generally burn in a wildfire. So a wildfire will go across a bunch of forest, and then a bunch of vegetation that wildfire went through will actually be alive and not be burnt. It's a weird phenomenon. Only certain types of vegetation tend to burn. We're talking about very dry, usually dead vegetation or stuff that's very, very old. Dried out underbrush is very bad for this. When you find an area that's at high risk for burning, and you go in and you burn it, but before it gets out of control, you then put it out. So you essentially create a bunch of mini fires that are not wild because they're not out of control. You create a bunch of mini fires and you burn it away so that you can't have one big out of control wildfire. Because it's not as much, and because it's not burning through towns and stuff, you don't have as much of a variety of sort of particulate matter. It doesn't necessarily travel as far. You don't have as much of a percentage of the air with particulate matter in it. It's just kind of a better situation. If you have 100 acres of forest, all 100 acres of that forest is going to burn at some point in time, or you'll get cut down for pulp and paper usage. But if left alone, all 100 acres of that forest at some point is going to burn. It's just a question of whether you want it to burn slowly in a precise way where people are controlling it, or if you want it to burn all at once. If it burns all at once, you get a wildfire. If it's precise and precision targeted and managed, then you have a controlled burning situation. Or you have a controlled burn situation, you have a forest management program, essentially. So what we need to do, and this, no one disagrees on this, we just disagree on how much money we're supposed to be throwing at it. What you need to do is you need to go in and burn down the forest in such a way that it is not going to get out of control and it's still good for the ecosystem, etc. First Nations in Canada, especially ones that live nearby forests, have been talking about the need for them to be involved in controlled burns for over 100 years. There is a huge debate around this in Canada right now. I'm not going to get into a lot of the specifics of that, but when I get into the solutions later in the video very shortly, you'll kind of probably allude to a bit of this. If you want me to get into a longer video about the interaction with First Nations and forest fires, etc., that'll be a different video if you want. Let us know in the comments if you'd like that. But keep in mind, you've got to light the forest on fire, and it's got to be done by professionals that know what they're doing, because you have to put the thing out. There actually have been a few wildfires that have been caused by controlled burns going awry, but they're not too common. Usually, we're pretty good at doing this. So I want to take you back very quickly to the idea of that lightning strike, because we talked about it earlier. 81% of the area burned in Canada is by lightning strikes. You have that remote section that has, old and dead vegetation. Lightning hits it, and then you have this burn that starts, and we find it too late. By the time we find it, you can no longer control it, and you have a wildfire. That's the majority of the huge wildfires in Canada, how they happen. If you can find that dead vegetation area and you can burn it away and then put the fire out because you're already there, then when the lightning strikes that area, it doesn't cause a giant wildfire because you've burnt the fuel away. That's the goal. That's sort of what you're trying to do here. Okay, I'm trying to give you an idea for the exact risk that's trying to be prevented. There is some element of humans doing really dumb things with camping, for example, or people just lighting forests on fire with vandalism. That does happen too. But in Canada, we're pretty good at dealing with that, comparatively speaking, to the lightning strikes. You obviously still have to have things in place for the human element, but the giant wildfires, you need controlled burns. For this final section here, we're going to talk about overall recommendations, questions I've been asked, and the things that I would recommend specific to wildfires. Very often I get asked, okay, well, what would you do? Or what would you recommend? And one question I've actually received, I've gotten this quite a few times, is sort of what's like the vision or what's the ideal pie in the sky idea? So this next idea is going to be very, very opinion based. I haven't run the numbers on it yet, but this is sort of like a visionary idea. It's not a, hey, let's do it tomorrow type of deal. So just, kind of a brace for impact here, right? My idea on how to fix this controlled wildfire problem, risk challenge in Canada would be to basically create a second Manhattan Project. Now, when I say Manhattan Project, I don't mean the nuclear bombs and the secrecy. I'm speaking more to the scale or scope of this, a huge undertaking. Now, the reason for this is because Canada has more boreal forest per capita than anywhere else in the world. We have these huge forests. We have a very highly educated population. We're good at doing education. We're the type of place that could actually create huge expertise in wildfires. What I would do, I know, infinite money, infinite resources, run the numbers, etc., is I would set up educational institutions nearby or in First Nations communities. I would integrate First Nations in Canada heavily, and I would put a lot of money into training people who live in Canada, Canadian citizens, etc., into being world-leading wildfire experts and making wildfire fighting a core competency of this country. The reality is that we are set up to be the best in the world when it comes to this. And if it's such a predominant, obvious, present hazard for us, why not just get really good at doing it? As far as revenue is concerned and sort of paying for this, I would think that, one, we would save a lot of money because of the damage that we'd be preventing, which would be helpful. And then two, if we become the world leaders on wildfire fighting, we effectively are able to export our expertise and assist the other nations in the world with their forestry and wildfire situation and be compensated for it. It makes a lot more sense for one country or a couple countries, but really in this case, because the way our Canada, to become sort of the world expertise on this, and then for everyone just to kind of rent our expertise or to compensate us for it. Say, hey, we're going to have a fire season. Can you fly over and just fix it for us type of deal? It makes a lot more sense for that than for every nation to try to do this, just because of the way specialization works. I think that there is actually a serious opportunity for Canada to turn this particular risk into an entire expertise sector and go all in on it. I think we could be really, really good at this. The First Nations want to do it. We already have challenges with job creation in some First Nations in Canada and dealing with certain challenges there. We have the risk. It seems to me that that is a really, really good opportunity for the sort of thing that we could do. It would be a serious risk to take financially. It would be quite the undertaking, but we really could be the best at forest fires. This is something that we could be very, very, very good at. Once again, not just the response, but the prevention. Learning how to map out, find the specific areas, do controlled burns at a very regularly, very safely. It is sophisticated work that you would want to have higher education in. So just build a higher education and learn how to do the work. I think that that's something that we could actually be really good at. And that's kind of the pie in the sky idea. I'm not going to say that that is going to be what we do, but it's what I would like to see. That's sort of like the hope, right, for the future. Outside of that, so looking at the sort of regular lay people stuff, those recommendations. One, stuff you can immediately do now. You can work on getting funding. Back to sort of the initial start of this video. Now is the time to say, hey, let's actually put money towards prevention, towards caring about wildfires. I don't want to be breathing in all this XYZ. I don't want to have to evacuate people, every year, every couple years and rebuild all their homes. There's no need for people to go through all of this hardship when we could just focus on the problem. Now is the time to focus on fixing the problem. Look at date, please. Now is when you do that. When the incident is actively going on is when you say, hey, look, government, hey, look, private industry, hey, look, whoever, we want to fix this problem now before we move on. Fix it before we forget. So that's the first thing. Second, on a more personal level, look, you could use this opportunity to say, what do I do for emergency planning for my own self, for my family, etc. If your house was going to catch on fire, if your city had to be evacuated because there was a hazard coming that necessitated evacuation, how are you going to evacuate? Where are you going to go? What does that look like? Going through a quick little exercise of what would I do so that you have some peace of mind or a plan in the event that something like this happens. Doesn't necessarily need to even take more than 5 minutes, might not be the worst use of your time given that this is on your mind now. Sure, something like that is pretty simple to do, and I think that a lot of people would benefit from that. What would I do if blank? Another thing that you can do, and we have an article going out on this, I believe by the time this video goes up, it'll already be out, and we should be doing a follow-up video that relates to that article that'll come out sometime after this video. Working on your own personal resilience to be ready for anything. There's things that you can do individually to be ready for any disaster. And there's a whole list of things separated by the pillars: prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, the pillars. So there's a whole bunch of things that you can do. Maybe focus on one of those things because it's productive and it helps you overall. If you really, really become motivated around this, you could go become a firefighter. You could go directly fight the wildfires yourself. Or actually, and I want to put this in, because I think I don't want to be too harsh on specific governments here. And it's not that governments are all bad or all good, but in relation to emergency preparedness, Ontario did create something called the Ontario Corps, which was sort of inspired by the AmeriCorps. What Ontario Corps is it's a organization of volunteers that act as a sort of backfill for extra people power in the event of a disaster or an emergency. So the government coordinates a huge list of volunteers and organizations that help with disasters. And in the event there is a massive event, they're able to say, okay, you know, this is happening here and here and here. We need this. Who is willing to come help? So it's a coordinated, organized volunteer agency for dealing with disasters to gain more resources that is coordinated through a central command. Very, very smart, very well done. Something that my industry has been asking for years. One thing that the developing world tends to do better than the developed world when it comes to disasters is they will often know they have no resources, and they will bring in the community members and try to, you know, scrape together what they can. In the developed world, one thing that commonly happens is the experts say, basically, get out of my way, and they don't incorporate the local community into helping with the response. This creates a way to get the local community members involved in the response in a way that's positive, so that you can leverage their expertise and their resource. So instead of everyone kind of being in your way, they can be part of solving the problem and part of helping. Really, really good. I'm very happy that we started doing that. That's still response focused, but still it's good that we're sort of trending in the right direction. And for that reason, I think that, you know, when you start talking about risk management or disasters, prevention and all this, I don't necessarily think that all of this is falling on deaf ears. I don't think that governments don't care. In fact, based on recent policies we've seen and sort of the things that have come in, it appears to me that governments might actually be interested in doing some of this stuff, and they might be okay with putting the budget forward. It just may have not been presented to them the right way yet. Or there may not be enough political will where they feel like they can get away with justifying it. The reality is that a lot of these measures are very, very expensive. Some of them will involve or necessitate tax increases to prevent something that will then never happen. Because if we put a whole bunch of money into preventing forest fires, and then we never have one of these big forest fires again, where like the air gets all bad, people go, well, what did I spend my money on? Because you don't notice the results when the thing doesn't happen. It's not as in your face. You only really notice prevention or lack thereof when something bad happens. So it's sort of speaking back to the prevention paradox and one of the issues there. If politicians are given enough motivation for saying, no, the people want this, they're willing to go in on prevention, they just don't want to deal with the wildfires anymore, I think that we might actually have the environment where they'll do it. So something to consider. Wildfires are quite interesting. I think that if you're in an area that has a serious air quality index warning and tells you not to go outside, you really shouldn't go outside. Yesterday, for example, in my area, the public health department actually closed its clinics because the air quality was so bad. So, I mean, when the public health department clinics close down because they don't want you to go outside and go to them because it's too dangerous, you know the air quality is bad. So, you know, respect emergency alerts that are given. Don't give yourself a long-term health condition or potentially death because of breathing the air. Yeah. If you have any questions, please send us in the comments. Stay safe, everybody.